So we are here today for the ICGS, or International Class of Government Studies first agenda, with the theme of leadership in times of pandemic crisis. And we will hear and learn about the theme from the one and only Mr. Michael Hatherell. But before we started, Mr. Ahmad Harakan Jamal, as the secretary of this department, on behalf of the chief of department who can attend this agenda because of a reason, would like to welcome all of us. So, Mr. Harakan, the time is yours.
Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hamdan wa syukranillah. Salatan wa salaman ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. The Honorable Pak Michael Hatherell, Ph.D. from Deakin University, Victoria, Australia. The Honorable Miss Andi Amitya Resti Duyanti as a moderator of this event, International Conference of Government Studies Lecture Series. The Honorable all students and lecturers of International Class of Government Studies, Department of Government Studies, Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Muhammadiyah Makassar, Indonesia. Thank you for coming today at ICGS lecture series on Zoom meeting. Thank you very much. And on behalf of Department of Government Studies, Universitas Muhammadiyah Makassar, we say thank you very much for the speakers, Pak Michael. As we know, Pak Michael is lecturer from Australia and can share a new perspective about leadership in times of pandemic crisis. So the theme of the ICGS lecture series is leadership in times of pandemic crisis. This event aims to discuss about leadership challenges in dealing with a pandemic crisis. So all of my students and lecturer can get a lot of information, knowledge and insight from new view. Because before the event, we can get view from lecture Muhammadiyah University of Makassar lectures. So now we can get new view, new insight from scholar in Australia especially. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmad Harakan. So now I will let our guest lecturer, Mr. Michael Hatherell, to run the agenda with all of the slides he prepared before. So the time is yours, Mr. Michael.
Okay, well, selamat siang semuanya, dosen-dosen dan mahasiswa-mahasiswi dari Universitas Makassar. Sayang sekali saya tidak bisa berhadir di sana di Makassar, tapi saya harap kalau pandeminya sudah selesai, saya bisa secepat mungkin kembali ke Universitas Muhammadiyah di Makassar dan bisa berdiskusi langsung di sana. What I want to talk about today is leadership, and hopefully it's a different perspective on leadership. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which leaders use ideas and political stories and what that means in a time of crisis. Please excuse my Australian accent. Australians have very bad English accents. So if I speak too quickly or if there's anything that's unclear, please let me know, or please ask questions during the question and answer time. So what I want to talk a little bit about today in breaking up this topic is to begin with looking a little bit at theories of social construction and what this means for how we understand leadership. I think this is something that is very important in a time like this and is probably a little bit different to the normal way that we look at leadership. So that's where I wanted to start. And talk a little bit about how we assess the deeds, so the actions, and the words of leaders, so we can understand the full range of leadership in a time of crisis. And then I want to talk about the role of narrative and political stories, and particularly to talk about that during a time of crisis and relate it to the COVID-19 pandemic. And towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about some different countries. I'll focus on the United States, on China, an Australian perspective on what's happening here. I'll talk a little bit about Indonesia, and I also want to talk about New Zealand, Selandia Baru, because I think New Zealand is an interesting case study for us to look at for political leadership as well. But before I get into that, I'll put my arguments up front at the beginning of the lecture. So what I'm going to argue is that understanding a pandemic like the current one, like COVID-19, means not just understanding a health crisis, but it means understanding an economic, a political, and a social crisis as well. And the relationship between the health, the economic, the political, and the social sides. So it's very complex. There's a lot of impacts from one part of the crisis to the others. So that makes it really important for us, if we're political scientists and trying to understand politics and government, we need to understand all of those different impacts. I also want to talk about the role of leadership during those times, the fact that it is more important, but we also know that leaders can be more damaging during times of crisis as well. So there's a potential to have a great impact and to protect people and to lead to a better future. There's also a very big potential to damage our government, to damage our societies, and to lead to worse outcomes as well. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things beyond leadership. So we focus on leaders and I think publics. Certainly in Australia, we focus on Donald Trump or Scott Morrison or President Jokowi. We focus on the big leaders, but we also need to understand the social and political structures, the nature of political institutions. These things are just as important for us to understand if we're looking at leadership. And even things like geography when it comes to pandemics and luck. Luck plays a role here too that we need to understand. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact and the meaning layer. This is the reason that I bring up social construction. I want to talk about how leaders deal with the facts on the ground, but also how they deal with meaning and how they create meaning for societies. And I want to talk about how political narratives are important when we create meaning. I think that's very important for us to understand when we're looking at political leadership. And really the skill of leadership, and the main argument that I have is a skilled leader is able to connect the fact layer with the meaning layer. So they're able to develop good policies that make sense scientifically and according to public policy knowledge that we have, but to also bring together people and convince different actors that this is the right way to go. So leadership is about both of those things and doing it in a combined way. And it is very, very challenging. We know many more cases of leadership failure than we do of success. So I think that's very important. So they're my arguments, and I'll try and unpack those as we go. Just briefly on the pandemic, and I'll focus on a couple of countries later on in the presentation. As I mentioned before, we need to understand this certainly as a health crisis, and sadly, a lot of people have been affected. A lot of people have become sick, and a lot of people have passed away as well. So we need to understand that side of it. And that's obviously the driving factor behind what governments are trying to do. But of course, we've had the economic, the social, and the political crisis at the same time. And I think we also need to understand that within the context of the last decade, we've already seen over the last decade in many different political systems and internationally, we've seen a lot of quite damaging dynamics, some really troubling things happening in different countries. We've seen populism in many countries. We've seen the rise of Donald Trump in the United States, which is, in my view, one of the more damaging things for American politics in a long time. We've also seen weakening economies in many places and some social fragility. And these things were around before the pandemic hit. So when we're looking at leadership during the pandemic, these leaders are dealing not just with this crisis, but with all of the things that were already there, all the things we already needed to deal with. We know in the context of Indonesia that last year was a challenging year as well. There were many things that were already happening before COVID-19 arrived. So I think that's an important part of the context. We also know that diseases are complex, that it is tricky to understand something like COVID-19, that sometimes viruses don't adhere to our human understanding, and that can make things a little bit difficult or tricky for us. So when leaders are standing up and trying to convince the public to make a sacrifice or to change their behaviour, it can be very difficult to communicate why they should be worried about something like COVID-19, particularly when it does have some quite random results. You have some people who aren't affected at all, who don't even get sick, and you have some people who are affected really badly and pass away. So the complexity of the disease is also an issue that we need to understand. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between facts and meaning. One person I often go back to is Machiavelli. I don't know if you've studied Machiavelli a little bit in studying government already, but Machiavelli wrote about the difference between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be. That was one of his main contributions, was to argue that we need to understand the world as it is, the real world, and not as we want it to be, perhaps with our application of morality. So he was already talking about this difference between facts, but also the meaning that we put on top of that. I've also put in an Avengers slide for anyone who's watched Avengers recently. And I know Jokowi seems to be a big fan of Avengers. He's talked about Thanos a few times in different speeches. But there's a line in Avengers where some of the characters are talking and they talk about a place called Nidavellir. And one of the characters says that's a made up word. And Thor says all words are made up. And I think this is a really important line in thinking about social construction, because that is true. Languages are made up. They're part of the social construction and the way that we understand the world. And I think when we're understanding leadership, this layer of meaning, where language is so important, that is something that is really important to understand. And I'd encourage you in studying leadership and studying leaders to also think about language. And I think that Indonesian students have an advantage here, because often, I mean, where I come from in Australia, most people only speak one language and they're not really aware of the differences between how people speak and the meaning that can be carried through language. I think students in Indonesia have a better understanding of language and the role that it plays, because you often speak Bahasa Daerah and then Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Inggris in this class, and then perhaps other languages as well. So language is a very important part of our study of politics. And as we look at the social world and we think about social construction, the theories around social construction that are part of constructivism, and it can be a quite scary theory, but really all it tells us is that there is a social world, that us humans have made and that we are constantly remaking. So this social world is the governments that we make, it's the economic systems, it's the interactions and the community organizations. These things are all part of a social world that we have generated and we have put together. So constructivism draws our attention to this social world and tells us a little bit about what it's like. And in that social world, we need to think about the subjective and also the intersubjective. The subjective are the things that happen inside our own heads. So the way in which we process the information around us. And we know that two different people can see the same thing. They can see a competition between Jokowi and Prabowo in the last election and have two very different opinions or views about what it means. So we need to understand what happens inside our own heads. We also need to understand the intersubjective. What happens when communities get together and communicate with each other and talk about things that matter? They bring a lot of meaning to that as well. So I think constructivism is important for studies of leadership. You also need to understand public policy and how things work, but I would encourage everyone to look into some theories of constructivism and what they tell us about leadership, because I think there's a lot of insight that we can gain there. And there are many authors now who are talking about intersubjectivity and the social world and how it affects our political system and the world around us. Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens* and several other books, he's talked about the role of the ideas that we have in bringing humans together into larger and larger societies. Charles Tilly was a very famous political scientist and historian. He talked about the role of stories in doing essential work in social life, bringing together people for large common projects. So these authors have looked at the role that ideas play in bringing us together and feeling like we're part of something together, and that we have some sort of mission that we need to accomplish as communities or as societies or as governments. So this is where I'm starting with the theory and in talking about the role of ideas and the role of meaning. And in its most simple form, this brings us to understand leadership and understand politics from two different layers. One is the fact layer. That's the physical manifestations, the things that we can go and count and see, the effects of policies, the state of our economy. These are the things that we can go and actually try and understand and measure. And above that, we have a meaning layer. And that's where we try and understand the world around us and debate what it means and debate what we should be doing and what the good thing is to do. So these are two different layers that are connected. But if we only understand the bottom layer, then I think we miss something important about political leadership. And I think quite often we're drawn to the bottom layer. We want to go and understand whether a leader is good or bad through an assessment of their public policy. But leaders also work at the top layer as well. Leaders also create meaning. They use ideas, they use stories to try and connect with us. They can use them responsibly. They can also use them irresponsibly and do bad things. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But this is what I try to apply in my research. I mostly focus on the meaning layer. So in my writing on political leadership, I don't spend a lot of time measuring the success of policy. There are other people who are good at doing that. I mainly focus on how leaders try to bring people together around common stories, common narratives. And that's the focus that I've had. So if we applied that to an example from the last election, I've been working on a research project looking at the political narratives in that last election, particularly between Jokowi and Prabowo. But we can look at the facts. We can look at the evidence of public policy success or failure between 2014, 2019. So was Jokowi successful as a president during that time? What does that mean for his re-election? Should we support him? Should we not? What is he proposing that is different? What are the public policies or the things that he's putting forward as part of the 2019 election? So we can do things like that. But Jokowi wasn't just focusing on the facts. He was trying to put together a story. He had this bigger theme of Optimus Indonesia Maju. This came out a lot in advertisements, in speeches. It was often yelled out in some of those speeches. But this carried a lot of meaning. This is the story that Jokowi wanted to tell. He wanted to say, we have been quite successful for the last 5 years, that we should continue with that success. So we should be optimistic. We shouldn't talk ourselves down. And his focus, of course, is mostly on infrastructure and on development, economic development. We've seen that as a major focus of the campaign. So this idea of kemajuan and continuing on with that. And there was part of that story, which we can talk a little bit more about, but leaders operate at these two levels. Yes, we need to understand them from the fact layer, but we also need to look at the meaning layer and understand the ideas that they're using as well. I included this part of a speech from the campaign at the Bung Karno Stadium. I thought this was an interesting example of some of the storytelling that Jokowi used and the way that he described leadership. In this, he talked about a leader as someone who steers a large ship. In Indonesia, is this large ship. And we know with large ships that it's very difficult to steer them. They're very heavy and it takes time to steer them. And he talks about menakodai kapal besar, that's the role of a leader to do that. And in this speech, he's comparing himself to Prabowo and saying, this is someone who hasn't driven a ship like this before. I've done it for the last 5 years. I was the governor of Jakarta. I was the mayor of Solo. You can see in here that he talks about his previous experience, and that tells you that I can be a captain of a large ship, that I'm someone who's able to do that. So this sort of storytelling and this narrative is the way that leaders try and simplify the idea of what they do. Now, you might disagree with him about it or agree from a public policy perspective, but I think it's important that we look at these stories and these ideas that leaders do. Now, just because the meaning layer is more than just facts doesn't mean, so it's not that they're irrational if they're operating at the meaning level. So we shouldn't just think about this as rational thinkers who are good and people who create stories who are bad or are lying. But these sort of things do matter. And if you ever watch Star Trek, I don't know if there's many Star Trek fans in Indonesia, but we had the contrast usually between a captain who was more emotional, and his job was to bring people along with ideas and to understand the morality of what they were doing. And we had Spock, who was the technical officer and understood the science and understood whether something was true or not. And that was his focus. And this was always a tension between the technical reality and the person who was telling the stories and spreading the ideas. So that was a focus there. So we shouldn't just think about it as good or bad, that the leader who focuses just on technical things is the good one, and the leader who is telling stories is the bad one. I think leaders need to do both of these things, or need to bring together both of these things. And this brings us to the difference between information and ideas. And one of the problems with the focus on fake news and hoaxes and disinformation, misinformation, is that we tend to have a quite limited idea of what information actually is. And we don't really focus as much on ideas, because there is a very big difference between information and ideas. And information lives as that fact layer. There are basic things about the world that we can know and we can measure and try and understand. But most of what we debate as humans doesn't live there. It lives at a higher level. It's about ideas and about how we understand the world around us. And just because we have this social world that I've talked about, just because we share ideas and we construct as humans this world around us, it doesn't mean that it's less meaningful. In fact, most of the things that mean something to us are actually part of the social world, not part of that fact layer or the physical world. So nations, there's nothing natural about a nation. These things are things that we've created that are part of our social world. Marriage, I'd argue, it's a social convention. It's a thing that's part of our social world. These things are the most meaningful and important to us, but they live in that social world. But if we accept that they are part of the social world, then we also accept that they can change, that it relies on human action and interaction. So things that live in the social world, unlike the physical world, can change with human action much more easily. And that's a very important point as we look at changes in social conventions and in political ideology over time. But at the same time, ideas can often be very sticky and they can last for a very long period of time. And anyone who's been an activist or tried to change the ideas that people hold will tell you that it's very hard to change a population's perspective. And that can be a good thing if you think the ideas are worthwhile and important. It can be a bad thing if you think that there are parts of your nation or of your society that are not effective or not the right things to be there. So this can make social constructions quite tricky to change over time. But these sort of constructions serve a purpose. We have them for a reason, and we use them as part of our world, the world around us. So I want to talk a little bit about narrative. If we're talking about the way in which leaders use ideas to try and convince audiences, I think we can draw a lot from looking at narrative. And we have literary studies that study the way in which stories are constructed. And if you enjoy reading fiction or comic books or movies, you're very familiar with the way in which stories work. And there is a growing interest in political science now to understand political narratives. So they take the way in which narrative is used in the literary world and use that to understand how leaders use political narratives and political stories. And we have a lot of scientific evidence now about our brains that tells us that we listen to stories and narratives much more than we do to basic facts. The things that we remember and stay inside our brain usually are things that come to us in a more interesting way. And we're seeing more and more science come out about that. And I can recommend some good books on that science if you're interested. But the parts of fiction that we're familiar with, the setting, the plot, the characterization, the message of a story, these are things that we see in political narratives. We see them use a setting, which is usually the nation or the society that they're part of. We see a plot, usually that connects the past with the present and with the future. So talking about where we've come from, the struggles that we've had, the bad leaders in the past, and talking about the present as the time in which we're competing for political power and the different things that have happened and what has caused what. That's all part of the plot. And usually leaders are promising that better future. So they're trying to connect that as part of their storytelling. The characterization, I think, is the more interesting part. And that's where leaders talk about themselves. They present an image of themselves. There's some great words, I think, in Indonesian to describe how leaders do this. And some of them are nicer and some are less nice. But I think characterization is an important part of political narrative and of political stories. So I think if we're trying to understand political leadership, I would suggest having a look at political stories, at political narratives. And there's some really good studies that are coming out about how this works. Unfortunately, a lot of it in the American context. So American presidents are the most commonly studied through this lens, which is bad for us if we're in Indonesia and Australia, because we have less content about our own leaders. But I think increasingly in Australia and hopefully in Indonesia, we'll get a sense of the way in which leaders use stories and storytelling. Just briefly, there are different sorts of narratives. There are ones that talk about whole systems and the whole world around us. There are ones that talk about identity and the identity that we share and who we are. And there are narratives that talk about single issues. So narratives can work at different levels. And in fact, political leaders can have very big narratives that shape their whole career. And I think some of the ones that I talked about with Jokowi earlier, he has a narrative that he's used since his time in Solo through to Jakarta, through to being president. His narrative has been quite consistent through that time. But there are individual stories that leaders tell as well. Sometimes anecdotes, smaller stories that they use to try and talk about who they are. The Jokowi campaign during the election period shared, I think in early 2019, a video about Jokowi's childhood. And leaders talking about their childhood is a very interesting source of political narrative, and one that I think we should pay attention to, because they're not just talking about their childhood and how they grew up. They're talking about their vision for their country, the things that they think need to be fixed, or the type of leaders that they think are needed. And in this video that Jokowi's campaign team produced, it's in a cartoon form. You can see Jokowi's narrative come through there about his struggles through his life and what he thinks that means for political leadership and the qualities that we should expect from political leaders. So these narratives work at different levels. They can be very big, or they can be just part of single speeches. But usually there's a relationship between the two. So this leads us to looking at leaders from two different directions. And I think that we're more used to looking at what leaders do So understanding public policy, understanding good public policy and the different sciences that underpin that. So right now, medical research is obviously very important in understanding pandemics, but often we turn to economic analysis, we turn to public policy literature to understand how effective a leader is. And we tend to look at political communication as how they communicate what they're doing. So their way of reporting to us what they have done or what they will do. But I think we should also focus on what leaders say, because I don't think that's just reporting their concrete actions. I think what comes out of a leader's mouth is very important and is a big part of their role as a leader. And one of the reasons for having leaders is that they stand up in front of us and share stories, share ideas, and try to bring the community together. I think we understand that as humans. We're attracted to listening to people talk. But often when we study leadership in government studies and in political science, there is less focus on narrative and on rhetoric. Or we tend to see it as a bad thing, as a negative thing, a study in how leaders lie to us or how they engage in pencitraan without really thinking about the qualities that we actually want from a political communicator. So I think combining these perspectives is important. Political leadership brings together good public policy with effective political storytelling and uses that political storytelling to communicate a message about public policy and tries to bring people along so they understand at least the public policy that's been enacted. They might not agree, but they understand and there's a consistent message. And I think that is good public policy in any time, but particularly during a pandemic. Just very briefly, in the book that I wrote about political leaders in Indonesia, my focus was really on these things. It was on how local and regional leaders, so looking at wali kota, looking at gubernur, how they present themselves and the ideas that they use in telling their story. So I wasn't looking at them from a public policy perspective, and I wasn't assessing whether they were good or bad leaders. And some of the places that I traveled to study this, the question was about, do you think they're good or they're bad leaders? And that wasn't really my intention. And I, in some ways, I don't think that's really good for a foreign researcher to be coming to tell people that their leader is good or bad. That's for voters and for publics to decide. But I think there is value in understanding how the leaders operate and the ideas that they use. So that was the focus of my book. And I can share some copies if that would be useful of the book. I'll send through some digital copies of that. And what I really uncovered in the book was looking at the stories that these, what I called innovative technocrats. So I was looking at the common themes between the leadership of people like Jokowi, people like Ahok, people like Ibu Risma, Ridwan Kamil. So a lot of different leaders in regions and local areas in Indonesia. The commonalities in their style of leadership, even though they're quite different, and even though some people like one leader but don't like the other. So some people like Ibu Risma but don't like Ahok, or vice versa. But I think there are some common aspects of the way that they approach politics, the way that they present themselves as characters in their own political story. All of these leaders talk about themselves as technical experts. Now, Ridwan Kamil is an architect before he enters politics. They all have this technical background that they talk about and they draw on. They all talk about themselves being pulled back to politics, that they weren't career politicians. They went and became architects, or they became lecturers in Makassar. They became these different things, Jokowi having his own business, but that the community was calling on them. The community needed people like them and their technical skills to come and share them with the community. So the way that they talk about themselves as a character is very interesting and very similar, I think, across all of these cases. They talk about being apolitical, not connecting to political parties, and they use political parties when they need them to get nominated, but they don't really connect with the political parties. Jokowi might be a slight exception to that. He does obviously have a close relationship with PDIP, but even that relationship is not the most important thing about Jokowi. He presents himself as the main character, not PDIP. The supporting characters, they talk about the community and what the community wants. They talk about other politicians who lack skill or don't have the experience that you can't trust to govern. They talk about the setting, and to start with, often this is in local office. So you look at Ridwan Kamil and the way that he talks about Bandung. Look at Jokowi, the way he talked about Solo very early on. And his early political narratives talked about traveling or walking around Solo and seeing the public policy problems and wanting to do something about that. So for him, the setting was Solo. He told stories about that city. And then, of course, it becomes bigger. It's Jakarta. And now it's the whole of Indonesia. So that the setting changes in these political narratives as they go from one level to the other. For Ridwan Kamil, obviously now whole of West Java. And the plot is very similar with all these leaders as well. They talk about the need for leaders who go out and see things with their own eyes, who get their hands dirty, who engage in things like blusukan. And even if they don't talk about the word blusukan, they're kind of doing something like that. And there's a lot of shared ideas, I think, in this type of leadership as well. So anyway, that was my argument for my book. It'd be interesting to see how that has changed in recent years. And I haven't been able to go back to Indonesia for some time. So I'm a little bit out of date. I'd love to hear your perspectives on local and regional leadership in particular. So narrative leadership in a crisis, I think, is really important. Obviously, public policy matters when we have a moment of crisis. The things that a leader does or does not do, they have a very big effect. But the things that leaders say or don't say, and the narratives they use or don't use, I think these things are really important for us to understand as well. I can very argue that during moments of large-scale crisis, people are looking for meaning. People are challenged and looking for something to believe in and something to connect with. So yes, they're looking for a better economy. They're looking for health initiatives, for better testing during a pandemic. But people are also searching for meaning. I've noticed this with my own father. My father has really struggled in lockdown in Victoria, and he's luckily healthy and not challenged by the virus, but he's looking for meaning and he's trying to connect with different political ideas because this is a time of turmoil and his world is changing very quickly. So these are really interesting moments, I think, when we look at ideas and look at political narratives as well. And we can see that public policy decisions in times of crisis do matter. You can look at Habibie during 1998, 1999. The decisions that he made in that time were critical, I think, for Indonesia. You can look at an example like Lincoln during the American Civil War. So leaders do make these really important decisions during times of crisis. But political narratives shift very quickly during a time of crisis, and there are also a lot of competition from other ideas and from other actors. And we've seen in many different political systems, not just in Indonesia or America, but in Australia, pretty much every country, we've seen hoaxes, we've seen misinformation, disinformation. We've also seen a lot of legitimate competition of ideas. And we shouldn't call all of that hoaxes or misinformation. Just because people disagree or have a different idea, it doesn't mean it's a hoax. But it's becoming harder sometimes to tell the difference. So there is a lot of competition during moments of crisis, and leaders have to compete with all those different things during these moments. And that's not easy. A very good book on this is Ronald Krebs' Narrative and the Making of US National Security. So again, a United States case study there, but Krebs writes about narrative, I think, in a very good way, and talks about the way that American presidents have used narrative over a long period of time. A very interesting case study for us to look at and try and apply to our own leaders. Another way to look at this is to look at ideational power. This is a concept that I've written about a little bit recently. This is the idea that leaders can influence behavior just through ideas. And I think this is a really important thing because there are other forms of power. We can use the law. We can use physical violence. We can arrest people, put them in jail. There's other forms of power that we can use. But if we can use ideas to try and convince people to act in a different way, then that's probably better for us or for leaders, and it's better for the public as well. So understanding the extent to which a leader has ideational power and the factors that allow a leader to develop ideational power or to lose it, I think these things matter quite a lot. I'll try and apply this in a moment to some Australian examples and talk a little bit about how we might understand ideational power. So I talked before about the meaning and the facts layers, that the political world, we have this layer of facts, these things that we can measure about our world, and we have this layer of meaning that we as humans put on top of that. I'd say President Trump, he operates very comfortably at the meaning layer. Most of what he does is about telling stories and engaging in narrative and communicating to his supporters and other members of the American community through these ideas. He's very, very comfortable manipulating meaning. And from his business background, I think he's very comfortable engaging with humans and thinks that he can influence, manipulate, change behavior when he engages with humans. The unfortunate thing is that a virus is not part of the meaning layer. Viruses don't care what you say. They don't care what you argue. So the COVID-19 virus, tidak peduli, doesn't care what Donald Trump says or what his narrative is. So when he engages in unsafe actions with members of his close circle, and we've seen photographs from members of the government and Donald Trump's family without social distancing, not using masks, the virus doesn't care. So we can see here this mismatch between the meaning layer and the fact layer. And this really depends on what political issue we're talking about. If we're talking about North Korea and its nuclear missiles, North Korea is led by a human and its community is made up of humans. So to some extent, you can engage with them at the meaning layer. You can talk about what's the right thing to do, what's going to be better for them or better for America. Viruses are different. I think that's what makes something like a pandemic very, very different to other crises that leaders can engage in. But we are in a world of constant ideational competition. So even the fact that Donald Trump has got sick and that members of his inner circle have also picked up COVID-19 very irresponsibly, there is still different ideas floating around. Now, the Twitter post here may actually be a bot. We don't actually know. There's a lot of bots running around. But there are a lot of people who are trying to spin this in a positive way and talk about how this makes Donald Trump a great leader, how he's going to beat the virus, how he now understands the virus better than other leaders. So even these things that happen when policies don't work out or decisions made by leaders lead to bad results, there will still be this competition to try and affect the way that we understand an event and the meaning that we attach to it. So while some people in America argue that this makes Donald Trump a terrible leader, there are going to be supporters who say this makes him a good leader, or it makes him a better leader in the future. He better understands the virus. So this constant ideational competition, I think, is going to become much more a part of our world internationally, but also in domestic places as well, particularly with social media now, changes in digital media and access to that amongst populations. We live in a world of constant competition over ideas and perception. So let me talk about a few countries just to finish off with. So from the place I perhaps understand the best because I live here, even though I think Indonesian politics is much more menarik than Australian politics, but I'll talk a little bit about Australia. Australia has been relatively successful in handling the pandemic, but we did have a very large second wave that hit Victoria, so the state of Victoria in the south of Australia. So the leadership of Daniel Andrews, and that's the person in the photo here, it has been critiqued by a lot of people. His government allowed the virus to escape from some hotels that were isolating travellers that have come back from overseas. So the virus escaped, and there was very poor security that was put in place. So there were a number of failings from the government, and the government was critiqued for that. But interestingly, Daniel Andrews has gone to a press conference every day. So he has spoke in front of Australians and in front of Victorians every day for the last 4 or 5 months. He has been a quite effective political communicator, and the ideas that he uses are things like shared responsibility. So in his political rhetoric, he's talking about our shared responsibility, the need to do the right thing for the community, not let other people down. And he tries to draw on ideas of what it means to be an Australian and what it means to be a Victorian. So he's using identity to try and back up these messages. And this has been a test of his ideational power, because the governments in Australia don't want to use the police to try and enforce very strict lockdowns. And in Victoria, the lockdown was very strict. Basically, people could not go outside their house for anything except for very important reasons. So most people had to stay in their house. They had to stay locked down. It was very strict. And there were a couple of times when police had to be called out, and there are some concerns about civil liberties and what this means for civil liberties in the future. But largely, Daniel Andrews was quite successful in the message that he used and his ability to keep people on board. And his polling results that have come out recently are quite positive. He has about 60% support amongst Victorians, which is quite high in Australia. Usually in Australia, a popular leader has about 55%, 50% support. And a lot of leaders have below 50% support while they're in power. So he has done quite well during this pandemic response. But there are some concerns about some of the public policies that were enacted. And there are still concerns about whether the lockdown is too severe. This is the constant tension between protecting people's lives and protecting the health system versus protecting the economy. And there are a lot of people on particularly the right of politics in Australia. So this is the Liberal Party, who believe that lockdowns are not good and that they should not continue too long because it makes the economy very hard to restart. That is the major debate right now in Australia. It's between severe lockdowns versus opening up and letting the economy begin to heal itself, because we've had a lot of economic crisis here in Australia. I've talked a little bit about the United States already and about Donald Trump as a political storyteller. I think he's a quite effective political storyteller. He does it a lot. Unfortunately, his stories have a limited audience. So while they keep his support base together and while they make very committed supporters, there are a lot of Americans who will never agree with his political stories as well. So he can't convince a much larger portion of the US population to support him because of who he is and because of the nature of the stories that he tells. And that's going to be the problem, I think, for him in the upcoming election. That's why he's struggling at the moment in the polls and in particular some of the battleground states. But he's had very little interest throughout his whole time in power as a political leader in aligning the meaning layer and the fact layer. And we've seen a lot of critiques of him for that he operates at the meaning layer and he would prefer the facts to be whatever he says that they are. So he will tell us what the facts are, and if they're different, doesn't matter. So he's going to tell us what the facts are. And I think this is the worst form of political leadership to have during a pandemic. And it's probably a bad form of political leadership to have during any crisis. A leader who can't align that meaning layer with the facts layer. They can't engage in the science of what's going on, and they can't draw on the expertise effectively to support that. This is a problem of populism as well. Donald Trump is a populist leader, and we know that populists use a very simple form of storytelling. They focus on a bad guy. They focus on the bad guys that we need to combat. They talk about how threatening they are, and they talk about how the people need to come together to defeat those bad guys, whether they're internationals, whether they're an ethnic community or religious community. This is what populists do. They talk about bad guys, they talk about big threats. And that doesn't work so well when you have a pandemic and it's a very complex scientific situation. There's also some complexity in the United States with federalism. I'm sure you've studied to some extent the way that the US government is structured and the role that the states have. So this is one challenge. Even if Donald Trump wanted to do more to have a national response to COVID, he would still have to come up against state power and the role that states would play in that. And we've also seen tense partisanship. So the divide between the left and the right in the United States has become very severe over the last few years. This makes agreeing on anything, particularly a response to a pandemic, it makes it very, very difficult. And it means that you have part of the American population who have money, who have businesses, very large businesses, who want the economy to open up again. And you have another part of the population who are affected by the health side of this, who want a better response. And whether that's lockdowns or some other way of dealing with it, the American population is split, and that makes it very hard. Just very briefly on China, I think this is an interesting case. There's a lot of study of China where I am at the moment. I work at the Defence College here in Canberra. So there's a lot of attention on China. And I think a couple of points about China. China has been very successful, or was very successful in its initial lockdown. And we know authoritarian systems can often do this much more effectively because they don't have to worry about the backlash to locking people down and being very strict in those lockdowns. And throughout all the lockdowns in Australia, there has been backlash. There are people that don't like their freedoms being taken away. And that's the case in the United States as well, and in many other countries. In China, it's much easier to lock things down. And that, to some extent, is an advantage in a pandemic. At the same time, being an authoritarian system made it very hard to be transparent about the emergence of the virus to begin with. It meant that there was a delay in other countries understanding the nature of the threat. So this is the bad side of being an authoritarian government, apart from the lack of civil liberties and political rights and things like that. So I think when we look at authoritarianism, there are aspects of authoritarian governments which might be more effective during a crisis. In the long run, I don't think they're as effective in dealing with many other challenges that societies face as open political systems like Australia or Indonesia or the United States are. So I think China is going to face problems because they need to maintain a single narrative. They can't have any competition within the society. And that makes things quite challenging in some ways. Happy to talk about that a little bit more in the question time. You know more about Indonesia right now than I have. I haven't been there for 2 years. So what I get is from the outside. It's from news sources. It's from writers in Indonesia. My view is that the pandemic is a test for Jokowi's political narrative that he presented in 2019. He has this technocratic political narrative about what he sees as Indonesia's future. And that narrative rests on economic development. It rests on infrastructure. It rests on getting people into jobs and all those other things he's talked about. And then you have a pandemic arrive that puts all of those things under risk. And I think that has really challenged Jokowi's political instincts because he wants to get back to jobs, the economy, infrastructure. And of course, those things matter. We shouldn't think that they're unimportant. Health matters, people's lives matter, but of course the economy matters too. And particularly in Indonesia, where development is so important, getting people out of poverty, getting people higher up into middle class brackets. These are things that Jokowi's government has focused on. But it has led to, I think, some mismatch in the response and sometimes a lack of focus in whether it is about trying to get rid of the disease. We've had some lockdowns in some places. We've had changes in policy over time. So what is the focus? I think that sometimes has been a little bit confusing. Opening up Bali again to tourists when most other countries are not doing anything like that. So what does that mean? What's the focus here? What's the plan? That's perhaps something that is a little bit more confusing from the outside. I think the Jokowi government has to deal with some of the disadvantages of having poor health infrastructure to begin with. But even so, I think the Indonesian example, it hasn't been as bad as some people thought it would be, and certainly nowhere near as bad as the United States. And Indonesia and the United States have very similar population size. So we certainly haven't seen a situation as bad as the United States. At the same time, we haven't seen a situation as good as Vietnam. Vietnam is really the success story in Southeast Asia right now. So Indonesia comes in somewhere in the middle of those two. And you will know more about the reasons for that success or failure than me. And I'd be interested to hear your views on why Indonesia has done well or not so well during this time. And just before we finish, I wanted to talk very briefly about New Zealand, which is a very small country and one we don't talk about very much when we focus on governments. But it is perhaps the best example of success during a pandemic that we have right now. And the government of Jacinda Ardern is a really good case study for looking at effective leadership. This is someone who can connect those fact layers with the meaning layers and was able to draw on the science, but also bring people together for a common solution in New Zealand, not just the first time, but they had a second wave as well later on in Auckland. And the response was very effective, it was very quick, but it was also based on the science, based on a good understanding of what would work and what wouldn't work with the pandemic. I think Jacinda Ardern's style of leadership also points to the importance of collaboration. We often talk about strong leadership, and many political leaders want to project themselves as a strong leader. I think Prabowo is a great example of that. He wants to present himself as being kuat, really, really powerful, strong leader. There's a really good book by Archie Brown called The Myth of Strong Leadership, in which he talks about the importance of collaboration and that good leaders actually empower the people around them, and they rely on good advice, and they have coalitions, and they are good at those sort of things. So this idea of strong leadership being good leadership is actually a little bit simplistic. Good leadership is being decisive when it matters, but it's being collaborative in the lead up to that as well. There's a really good paper that's just come out on the New Zealand response, which I'll email through as well, and you can share that around. But I think it's a really useful case study for us. So just to finish up, I think it's already been 1 hour. Just some conclusions. So leadership in crisis, what works? And I think my argument through this presentation has been that good leaders, or the best leaders, they align the fact layer with the meaning layer. So they draw on good science, they draw on good advice, they have a good understanding of the world around them. So they go and see it with their own eyes if they have to, but they have good advisors and good systems that help them to understand what's going to work and what won't. They have good public policy processes, and they have good implementation processes for policy, but they're also able to tell good stories, and they're able to bring people together. These are the two things that I think effective leaders need to do. They need to draw on science, they need to be proactive, so they need to collaborate and understand a problem, but also be decisive when they need to be. And sometimes that means acting before you have full information. That was certainly the case in New Zealand. Some other countries that has not been the case. People have delayed a decision because they knew the economic impacts were going to be very big. You don't want to cause that damage, but it's meant that in the long run, things are worse. The health outcomes are worse. The economic outcomes are worse as well. When it comes to something like COVID-19, as Donald Trump has found out, science does matter. The disease doesn't care about your political arguments or about your ideas. So good leaders, I think, are able to draw on science and on different scientific opinion too, because we know science isn't always of the same mind. We know it's always changing, that people are always adding more information. Political structures, institutions, social capital, these things do matter as well. And we should pay attention to them. I've talked a lot about leaders, but we need to understand the structures and the institutions around those leaders too. Now, I think this pandemic has seen that societies who favour autonomy and freedom, open societies, that there are some challenges, because there is always a backlash to asking people to stay in their house or to close down their business when that's what they're relying on. So governments like China have often been a little bit more effective in locking down the virus. That's particularly true of pandemics. I think there are very big downsides to being an authoritarian actor in the long run, though. It makes it harder to deal with some other challenges that societies face. And I don't want to live in a closed society either. So that's a downside too. But I think that the biggest thing that we're going to have to grapple with, and the students here in the government program that you'll need to grapple with, is complexity. Our world has never been more complex. It is so hard for us as individuals to understand the world around us, let alone communicate it to other people. So how do you study leadership? How do you support good leadership? And how do you become a good leader in a world that is so complex, and where you're dealing with pandemics, where you're dealing with economics, social issues, religious issues? There is so much going on in this world now. We've never had so many people in this world. We've never had so much access to social media and the ability to communicate with each other in these ways. That makes it really hard to be a leader. And it makes it even harder to tell good stories, but good stories are needed. And I think the challenge of leading Indonesia is a really difficult one. So whether you support Jokowi or don't, whether you like Prabowo or don't like Prabowo, I think the challenge of leading Indonesia in the future, it's hard. How do you tell a story that brings together the Indonesian community in 2024? And particularly if this technocratic story has come under threat, if it hasn't brought the same advantages that Jokowi said it would. I'm looking forward to seeing who the challengers will be, whether it is people like Ridwan Kamil or Anies Baswedan that put themselves forward for the presidency in 2024. Sandiaga Uno, I don't know, lots of different people around, but it's a really big challenge, I think. I'll leave it there. I think that's time for the end of the lecture, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Michael, for the long explanation, but it's work. I mean, I can get everything you say. Hope the other student can get it too. Yeah. Jadi, can I speak in? Oh ya, okay. Jadi untuk teman-teman semuanya, tadi sudah dijelaskan oleh Bapak Michael ini tentang beberapa hal. Jadi bagaimana cara menjadi pemimpin yang baik itu di tengah kondisi yang seperti sekarang ini. Tadi itu dijelaskan kalau kita harus punya strong and good leadership, terus kita juga harus tahu bagaimana cara menarasikan sesuatunya itu ke masyarakat agar terjadi balancing antara apa yang harus kita lakukan dan apa yang seharusnya tidak kita lakukan untuk membuat keputusan yang kemudian baik. Tadi juga itu diberikan contoh oleh Bapak Michael itu dari 5 negara, dari Australia, Amerika, China, Indonesia, dan New Zealand. Jadi tadi dijelaskan beberapa perspektif dari kelima negara itu tentang how to run a good leadership di tengah krisis ini. Jadi di Australia itu ada 2 pendapat, ada yang mendukung lockdown, ada yang tidak mendukung lockdown karena harus tetap menjalankan ekonomi. Kemudian di Amerika Serikat, bagaimana dia tadi menjelaskan kalau Donald Trump itu adalah seorang storyteller yang bagus, tapi tidak terlalu mementingkan scientific. Jadi sehingga dia negaranya itu tidak memberlakukan lockdown. Terus Cina gampang lockdown-nya karena memang sistemnya sudah diatur untuk seperti itu, masyarakatnya sangat mendengarkan kepada pemerintah. Nah, di Indonesia ini masih terjadi kebingungan. Jadi pemerintahnya agak bingung apakah ingin mengutamakan ekonomi, people's life, or development, padahal ketiga hal ini adalah hal yang penting. Jadi ada confusing message yang mungkin diterima oleh masyarakat atas beberapa keputusan atau policy yang telah dikeluarkan oleh pemerintah Indonesia. Nah, untuk New Zealand tadi itu dicontohkan sebagai negara yang sukses. Mereka sukses untuk membalansingkan kebutuhan masyarakat dan apa yang dibutuhkan oleh negara di tengah krisis ini. Jadi ada kolaborasi yang bagus antara pemerintah dan masyarakatnya sehingga itu akhirnya membentuk a strong and good leadership. Seperti itu. Nah, for all of you guys, is there any questions? You can raise hand. You can use the raise hand application. Is there any question? Raise hand, raise hand. Yeah. Mulai. Sinta. Who else? Muli. One more person. Ilham. Okay, so we have 3 students. Muli, Ilham, and Sinta. Muli first. Muli, where is Muli? Okay. Muli, hello.
Serius?
Oh, yeah. Muli first. Host name.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, Muli, you can deliver your question to Mr. Michael.
Oh my God. So thank you very much for your explanation. That's such amazing time to can meet you. That's make me make clear, yeah. So clear with my assumption with how Donald Trump, the leadership, China, and also in another country. I think we about the leadership, we can we have to consider. Yes. We have to check and consider with how the character in our country, like it's very different with Australian and Indonesian. It's so different, and one of problem in government in Indonesia, the leadership is the central government data and the local government data is it's like a very not like different. Yes, I think that then there's so many problems how the government in Indonesia how the government wanna make some public policy. It's not measure with what we needed, like omnibus law and so on. I think that I really agree with what you say, sir. That we have to elaborate what the society need and what the country needed, and about Indonesia development economy and health is until here is not clear. Jokowi not can read it, not can be transparent. How they can membedakan differences, all of them. And my question is, I think that no. My question is about just what that Indonesia, oh my God, what that Indonesia, the leadership in Indonesia is we need it. Like I mean, with your explanation, it's very general. I mean, if you, I think you ever go to Indonesia with the different characteristic. I wanna make your approaching with how the character society in Indonesia. I think that so. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Muli. So, Mr. Michael, do you want to answer it directly or waiting for the two more questions?
I'm happy to answer directly,
Oh,
if that's
okay.
okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
If I
Please.
do three, nanti aku lupa. So,
Oh, yeah.
you know, lebih
Please
baik
do.
kalau langsung.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I think that's very, very interesting commentary on our situation in Indonesia. I think so your point about the difference in the data at the national level and the local level, I think that's a really, really interesting one. I mean, we've seen the decentralization project in Indonesia over the last 20 years. That's one of the more interesting things about the country. We went from such a centralized country to now having directly elected local leaders, governors, with more funds and more responsibilities. But there are still problems and challenges, of course. And one of the ideas with decentralization is that the local leader better understands the problems, and that in theory, they should be able to better use the resources they have to meet the needs of that community. And I think there's still some challenges with that. One of the challenges early on, I think, was that there was so much concern about different parts of Indonesia rebelling. And so when decentralization occurred, there's a lot of effort to make sure that it wasn't going to allow some regions to become too powerful and then try to pull away from Indonesia. Those concerns went away, I think, quite quickly. We saw Aceh reach an agreement with the Indonesian government. So decentralization has moved a long way in that time. But I think the question about data is a really interesting one. And how does a government know its people? And how does it know what they're facing and what they therefore need in terms of economic incentives? The leaders that I wrote about, they talk a lot about going to the community, this idea of belusukan. I think a really interesting study is to look at how effective belusukan actually is. So to what extent is belusukan pencitraan? How much is it showing your face and putting it on social media? Because these leaders are really good at that. They'll put photos of themselves riding a bike or talking to someone at the pasar. But to what extent is that pencitraan, or to what extent do they actually see things or get to understand the real condition out in the community? And I think perhaps they do. But if you're doing a scriptsy, or if you're doing some study on an issue, I think that is one to try and work out. How does a local leader or a government better understand the people? This would be interesting for people like Wali Kota, be interesting for Bupati. How did they understand the real situation and respond to that? I'm not sure I can give you great responses on what Indonesia should do right now, apart from some of the principles of leadership from before. But I think your point that Indonesia is different. Now, Indonesia and Australia are different. That's a really important one. And some of the critiques so there are writers in America and in Australia who have critiqued Jokowi's performance. I think some of that critique is fair, but one of the points that might be missed is that in Australia, the economic situation that we had before this, because of the mining boom in Australia, we had a lot of extra money saved up. The Australian government has the resources to economically support large parts of the population while we've undergone lockdown. Indonesian economy isn't in that position, and it's a much larger population, and development is so important. So we do need to understand the conditions of each country. We need to understand the priorities of each leaders, and they are facing different challenges. So I think that's a great point, and I hope I answered a little bit, but maybe we can discuss it later as well.
Oh, thank you so much for the answer. For the next question, Hasbi.
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Okay. Thank you for the time and great to interacting with you, sir. My question talk about leadership in pandemic crisis. What is your opinion? Who are the best country leader in making strategies to overcome a pandemic, and why you choose him as a good leader? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Michael?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one reason I included the New Zealand example. And I will share, there's a great paper that has just been done about the New Zealand response that I'll send through, and perhaps you can share around to the student group, because it does bring together a lot of these issues that we've talked about here today. And I think the New Zealand one it's a very interesting one because of the style of leadership that was collaborative, but also decisive, and made some very quick decisions that not everyone agreed on. And this is a really difficult thing to understand with leadership, is decisiveness and the role of luck in leadership. We study leaders through history, and we say this leader was a great leader or this leader was a bad leader. But sometimes leaders get very lucky or unlucky, and our assessment could completely change. So I think we need to be careful when we're studying leaders that we understand the extent to which they put their country or their community in the best place to succeed, or whether they were just lucky. And how we deal with chance or with luck, I think is really difficult, because we want to understand everything. If we're political scientists or studying politics or governments, we want to understand. We want to, memahami exactly everything that's going on. But sometimes there is luck. And an aspect of the New Zealand case study is that New Zealand is very far away from everywhere. It's an island country, and it's very easy to lock down. Those things are big advantages if you're trying to deal with a pandemic. If you are somewhere else, like the US is relatively isolated, but a very big country, a lot of travelers going there. If you're in Europe, there's some very big challenges, and parts of Southeast Asia, obviously, as well. Indonesia's geography, I think, is very interesting for studies of leadership. It has some huge disadvantages, but also some big advantages. In theory, it makes it easier to lock down different areas if they are islands like Bali or like Sulawesi or different islands. So I know it's not a great answer, but I think New Zealand's the one I'd look at for a really good case study, but also Singapore. Singapore is an interesting one. And Taiwan. Taiwan is a really big success case. Vietnam, if you want to look more closely in Southeast Asia. And again, with Vietnam, decisiveness and early decisions, I think in the long run will mean that they get good health outcomes. They've had very few deaths from COVID-19, but their economy is probably going to bounce back much quicker than many other places, including Australia. So I think they're the ones I look at: New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, and Vietnam.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. And for our last question, Sinta.
Halo.
Hai.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Before I a question for you, I introduce myself. I want to introduce myself. My name is Sinta Afiahnur, and I'm currently in the 5th semester about explanation leadership in time of pandemic crisis. The current leadership won't be easy, but we will make it. And this crisis put a leader in a difficult situation. They are work with problems that have never been faced before. And my question is two. One, how leaders or tips might be for leaders can survive and continue their duty, how to say,
Duty.
duties in the future. And second, my question is, how does the Indonesian and Australia leadership compare during the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinta. So she has two questions. How the leaders can survive in the future for doing his duty or the policy, and how Indonesia and Australia, what? Sinta? How Indonesia and Australia?
Leadership compared during the pandemic.
Okay, how we compare the Indonesia and Australia during this crisis? Mr. Michael, please answer.
Yeah, before I answer the two questions, I think the point about never facing this before, that's an important one. I think that's the challenge that you're going to face through your studies is how leaders and societies deal with complexity. We have dealt with pandemics before. So through history, political leaders have dealt with pandemics, and we saw one in 1918, 1919, but that was a more simple time. So I think you're right that we haven't faced a pandemic during a complex time like this. That is something that is new and very challenging. And this is why I think when we study leadership, we also need to study the systems and the institutions and the governmental structures that support leaders. Because if we think that leaders are going to solve all our problems in the 21st century, we're probably going to be disappointed. You know, kita akan selalu kecewa if we just bergantung pada kepemimpinan. I think it's going to take really effective governmental structures, good institutions, and good civil society as well. I think some of the more effective parts of Indonesia's response have been civil society groups, not the government, but parts of the community that have shared messages. I've seen, obviously I haven't been in Indonesia, but I've seen a lot of photos of people putting messages on walls in different parts around the country, messages of support and just a community spirit. And if we get to your question about comparing Australia and Indonesia, that's probably the first point that I'd make, that Indonesia has an advantage compared to Australia. In Australia, you may have already learned that we have a more individualistic society, that we are less community oriented. And so we don't know our community as well as we did in the past. I come from a desa in Australia. I come from a small town that has about 10,000 people. It's quite small. They have a lot of sheep. In my town, there is still some community spirit, like you might see in parts of Indonesia. But if you come to cities in Australia, you don't have the same sort of kampung sort of atmosphere or community spirit that you see in many parts of Indonesia. So if we talk about problem solving, whether it's pandemics or whether it is other issues, Indonesia has some problem solving tools that are not leaders, they're community generated. And that is crucial. I think Indonesia should not dismiss that you should actually see that as a strength, see that as something that can be built on in the future. It's an important thing that Indonesia has, Australia doesn't have so much anymore. In terms of the leadership of Indonesia and Australia during the pandemic, I think it's difficult to compare because the situations are very different. I think the Morrison government, I didn't talk much about Prime Minister Scott Morrison in the presentation. I talked about Dan Andrews, the Victorian Premier. But Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, he was very heavily criticised during the bushfires. You might have seen in the summer before the pandemic, we had very big fires all the way through Australia. And Scott Morrison was in Hawaii. He was on holiday. And a lot of people criticized him because he wasn't here. We had this massive disaster, and our leader was lagi libur. He's gone somewhere else. So people were very, very angry in Australia. And I think Scott Morrison learned a lesson from that. And he has tried to be more effective as a leader during the pandemic. But really, the state leaders have been more important to us during this time, because the situation in the different states is different. And the states have actually blocked each other. So you cannot travel between the different states in Australia. You can't go from Victoria to New South Wales or from Queensland to New South Wales. We can't move between them. So they've locked down, and the state leaders are leading the response. So the national government mainly has focused on economic measures. They've brought in some things like JobKeeper and Job Seeker, I think they call it. So these big measures to try and keep people in jobs and to keep companies from firing their workers. But the economic situation isn't great here. But I think it's a different challenge to Indonesia. So I think it's hard to compare. I know a lot of people would criticize Jokowi and the government there for perhaps the lack of a decisive response, but it is a different situation. So I'd be very cautious about comparing Indonesia and Australia. I don't think it really helps us very much to compare the two. In terms of your first question about how leaders can, I guess, move on and continue with their tasks, that is very, very difficult. We don't know how long it's going to be before this is over, and we don't know what the tail end is going to look like. So even when we have a vaccine for COVID-19, we're going to have a situation where some people have the vaccine and some people don't. Maybe medical practitioners will have it, but other leaders won't have it. That's going to be a really interesting situation. So there's no immediate recovery from this. And it's going to rely on political leaders to manage expectations as part of that recovery. That's really challenging. The last comment I'd make is that when talking about this meaning layer, leaders really have two purposes for engaging at the meaning layer. One is that meaning matters, and that's a good thing for society. We want leaders to pull us together and take us on a journey and make us identify with each other. But obviously leaders want to increase their own popularity too. So one of the reasons they engage at the meaning layer, maybe the main reason, is for their own popularity, their own electabilitas, their own prospects in the next election. So I know Jokowi can't compete again in 2024. He's in his second term. But many other leaders are looking to what this means for their future. So that's one of the challenges for us, is understanding how leaders create meaning for our purposes that's good for us, but also good for them. And sometimes it's hard to separate the two. I think with Belusukan, that's a really challenging one. Does a leader do that just for themselves, or does it have a good purpose for us as well? Can it be both? I think maybe it can, but maybe we need to criticize particular types of Belusukan. So I think some ways of engaging with the community are more about engaging with us, and maybe there are photos that are taken, whereas other forms of engaging with the community are just photo opportunities, and there's very little information that the leader actually gets, or certainly nothing that the community gains from it. That's very hard. So I know it's a long answer, but I think that's a great question and a really good point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very amazing and clear explanation from Mr. Michael. And thank you so much for all of the questions. I think you guys got what Mr. Michael explained to us before clearly. Mr. Harakan, do we have still time? Do we have time?
Oke, terima kasih. Maybe I speak in bahasa Pak Michael. Tentu mewakili program studi ilmu pemerintahan Department of Government Studies Universitas Muhammadiyah Makassar mengucapkan terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya kepada Pak Michael, salah satu sahabat kami yang luar biasa Sebagai informasi, pertemuan kami itu kalau tidak salah tahun 2018. Pada saat itu Pak Mikel berencana untuk meneliti tentang sosok kepemimpinan Prof. Nurdin Abdullah. Ya, sejak saat itulah silaturahim, komunikasi, pertemanan terbangun antara kami di program studi ilmu pemerintahan Unismuh Makassar dengan Pak Mikel di Victoria, Australia. Sekali lagi atas nama program studi kami mengucapkan terima kasih untuk Pak Mikel bersedia hadir bersama kami, adik-adik kami. Sebagai informasi, beberapa ada sekitar 12 orang di room ini adalah mahasiswa baru, new student of ICGS. So ya pasti mereka bahagia, senang. Pertemuan pertamanya bisa bertemu dengan sosok yang luar biasa. Saya kira seperti itu Mbak Nitya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Mr. Michael Hatherell. I really hope we can meet in person one day after this pandemic crisis.
I hope so too. It'd be great to come back. I really want to come back to Universitas Muhammadiyah. I'm going to share my email address as well. So if anyone does have any questions, hopefully you can see that now.
Yeah.
So please feel free to email me if you have any other questions or wanted to engage. But no, thank you for everyone for your great questions and for listening to me for a long time. I hope everything was quite clear, but please let me know if I can offer anything else. And I'll send through my slides as well if you want to have a look through those in more detail.
Teman-teman sudah dicatat? Ya, silahkan di-save emailnya. Jadi kalau ada pertanyaan bisa diketik dan kirimkan ke Bapak Michael. Ya. So,
ya, hopefully we can meet on offline class ya with Pak Mikel. Saya senang memanggil Pak Mikel karena Pak Mikel ini sangat mencintai bahasa Indonesia juga. Terima kasih Pak Mikel, insya Allah nanti komunikasinya dilanjutkan melalui email dan WhatsApp. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michael. Terima kasih. Ya, terima kasih juga teman-teman yang sudah menghadiri kelas ini.
Sampai bertemu lagi.
Ya, sampai bertemu.
Teman-teman boleh sampaikan. Oh, sudah. Sudah ada semuanya.